Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 14, All's Fair in Love and Law. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we saw English efforts to convert their native neighbours to Christianity. John Eliot, aided by the language and printing skills of James Printer and others, oversaw the translation of the Bible into Wampanoag. It was a genuinely impressive achievement, and alongside the printing of other religious texts into the native language, it supercharged the spread of Christianity in the region. We also saw how praying towns, with their praying Indian residents, sprung up all across New England. By willingly subjecting themselves to English law, custom, and religion, praying Indians gained the protection of the colonists, land security, and, of course, the salvation of their immortal souls. After his work on the translated Bible was complete, James Printer moved home to Hassanemeset, which was now one of those praying towns. It is not the last we've seen of him. Today, we'll cover the political side of the 1660s. Leadership among the Wampanoag changes, land deals fall into legal quagmires, and colonial rivalries give the Native Americans space to work towards their own goals. Over the last 2 episodes, I've tried to paint a picture which explains why the relationship between the colonists and Native Americans, which began with the first Thanksgiving and had only one case of outright war in 50 years, why this time of peace will collapse so bloodily in the 1670s. And I think it comes down to trust, and the gradual erosion of that mutual trust. Time and time again, Indians would complain to colonial authorities about their subjects. They'd settled on land that wasn't theirs, or their missionaries were spreading destabilizing ideas, or, yes, their pigs had rampaged through indigenous crops and left them at risk of starvation. And over the years, colonial authorities became less and less sympathetic to their complaints. Legal cases brought by Native Americans, accusing settlers of occupying more land than had been agreed, were increasingly thrown out. Appeals for compensation for lost crops were dismissed. Most worryingly, colonial governments sometimes used military force to pressure native submission to these decisions, imprisoning family members as bargaining chips and even threatening war. And when stories spread through indigenous networks that this Sachem had been coerced into selling land, or that Sansqua had colonists cut deals with her male relatives, or how the colonial courts had come to an unfair judgment, natives engaged with the colonists more warily, seeing their actions in a more negative light. All that said, the last thing I want to do is give the impression that the Native Americans were merely passive victims of the colonists, living peaceful and idyllic lives before the Europeans turned up and ruined everything. Not only does that make this history far too black and white and play into the noble savage myth, it also removes the agency of the people in this region. Different groups and different leaders took different approaches to the colonists. The Europeans were trading partners who could provide valuable goods like guns and rum in exchange for wampum and furs. A Sachem or Sansqua's ability to give their people access to this trade was an important part of their role. And if their rivals had access to these goods, especially if they were European guns, then it was essential to get their own. Also, the post-Pequot peace did not extend to intertribal rivalries, and violence and wars, particularly between the Narragansett and the Mohegan, carried on throughout the 1640s and 1650s. The sachems of both those tribes worked very hard to convince the English that the other was plotting against them. The Mohegans would win this battle for public opinion, and the United Colonies looked very suspiciously at the Narragansett. It's sometimes easy to lump the colonies of New England together. I mean, take that name, New England. It's at once a shorthand for the English colonies in this part of the North American coast, as well as a shared identity which the colonists themselves identified with. But, that shared identity aside, they were also in competition with each other for land, resources, and influence. They maintained their own relationships between each other and with neighbouring natives. A particularly stark divide within the New England colonies was between Rhode Island and the rest. Rhode Island was not part of the United Colonies of New England, the confederation of colonies which helped coordinate the defence and diplomacy of the English settlers. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Plymouth, and, until it was annexed by Connecticut, New Haven were all members. Rhode Island had never been invited to join. In the wake of the Pequot War, the victorious allies began to fall out and became more suspicious of the other. Old bonds between the first settlers and their native hosts were already beginning to fray when time began to take its toll. In 1660, the venerable Wampanoag sachem, Sachem, or known to the colonists as Massasoit, died. He'd been the sachem when the Pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower and provided a fixed point in the alliance system of New England. His position was inherited by his eldest son, Wamsutta. Both Wamsutta and his younger brother Metacom travelled to Plymouth to reaffirm the alliance between the colony and the Wampanoag. As part of this, in an elegant diplomatic flourish, Wamsutta asked the colonists to choose his new name. As we touched on a few episodes ago, it was very common for Native Americans in this region to adopt different names at different stages of their life. With his elevation to sachem, Wamsutta wanted to change his name, and he asked the colonists to choose for him and his brother. The colonists debated, and suggested the new sachem be named Alexander, after Alexander the Great, and his younger brother Philip, after Alexander's father. Which it might have made more sense for them to be reversed, but whatever, so far so good. The alliance was maintained, and the colonists were presumably flattered by the request. Now Alexander's territory formed a border zone between Plymouth and its northern and western neighbours, Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island. This was very valuable land, and settlers in all three colonies had their eyes on the best bits of it. Through their long-time alliance, Plymouth believed that the Wampanoag saw them as their foremost ally. But, shock and horror, in 1662, Alexander sold land to Rhode Island. As we'll cover in a moment, Rhode Island was the black sheep of the New England colonies. Sachem Alexander sold, or gifted, the Rhode Islander Peter Tallman a truly vast amount of land, which included the land of his wife, Weetamoo. More on her reaction in a moment. Plymouth sent word to Alexander saying, "Hey, don't sell land to any colony but us, thank you." But then Alexander did it again a week later, again to Rhode Island. Josiah Winslow, son of Edward Winslow, was the commander of Plymouth's militia, and when the colony learned that Alexander had ignored their earlier order, he was sent to fetch him. Finding the sachem isolated hunting, Winslow ordered him to return to Plymouth with them. The exact details of what came next are muddled, and the main post-war accounts, by Increase Mather, John Cotton, and William Hubbard, all present events differently. One thing they all agree on was that this summons had come because Alexander was suspected of plotting rebellion alongside the Narragansett, and Winslow had come to bring him back to Plymouth to answer for that. But there's no evidence for this motive. Instead, Plymouth records show that the rebellion, which the colony was so concerned about, wasn't a conspiracy between native tribes, but Alexander's dealings with Rhode Island. Alexander, though, agreed to come with Winslow, and at some point, the accounts disagree here as well, the sachem got sick. And then he died, leaving his family, including his wife Weetamoo, devastated by grief. Some reports say it was a natural illness, but especially among Native Americans, the rapid sickness and death of Alexander in English custody pointed at one thing: poison. It probably wasn't poison, but this affair did absolutely nothing to improve native-colonist relations. It just looked bad. An allied sachem, ambushed while hunting, placed under armed guard, suddenly dying? That was added to the list of grievances and suspicions, which was already quite long. Philip inherited his brother's position, and from now until his own death, Philip will be the Sachem of the Wampanoag. So why was it such a bad thing that the Wampanoag were selling land to Rhode Island? Well, Rhode Island had always been held at arm's length by its colonial neighbours. After all, the first settlement, Providence, had been founded by Roger Williams. Favouring religious toleration and a more cooperative approach to dealings with Native Americans, Williams was seen as a dangerous radical by many of his peers. Case in point, he didn't seek a royal charter for his settlement, because Williams didn't see how the King of England had any authority to grant American land. Instead, he received permission to settle from the Narragansett Sachem. His settlement soon grew as various religious dissenters were expelled from other colonies, such as the Hutchinsons after the Antinomian controversy. Squeezed between Massachusetts Bay Colony to the north, Plymouth to the east, Connecticut to the west, and the ocean to the south, these settlements could have easily been pulled apart. Instead, they united. In 1643, Williams received an official patent from Parliament, securing the borders of the four settlements and becoming a confederal alliance. But that didn't settle things, and the next 20 years was a constant series of disputes between the radical Rhode Island and its colonial neighbours. In a twist of irony, the Restoration brought Rhode Island its greatest champion, the King of England. After 3 years of petitioning, in 1663, Charles II granted the colony a royal charter, formally uniting the Confederacy into a single colony. The charter confirmed the colonists' previous rights, as asserted in their 1643 patent and the founding principles of the settlements. They could make their own laws, religious freedom was guaranteed, and oaths of allegiance were not necessary for public office, which was especially important for the Quaker population. Just like other colonial charters, it granted the colonists all the rights of Englishmen, as if they had been born in England. But the most interesting part of the charter was its approach to the Indians. Friendly relations between Rhode Islanders and their native neighbours are practically written into the charter. Apart from quote-unquote just causes, Rhode Island was not to attack the Native Americans, nor could any colony attack Native Americans within the boundaries of Rhode Island. It also states in black and white that the colony existed because of 3 factors: the providence of God, the hard work of the colonists, and, quote, by purchase and consent of the said natives, end quote. One 19th century historian highlights why this mattered, quote, the other colonies claimed the soil by virtue of grants from the king, and confirmed their titles by purchase from the Indians or by conquest. Here, the paramount title was held to be in the Aborigines, and the right, first obtained by them by purchase, was only confirmed by patent from the crown, end quote. That historian, Samuel Green Arnold, argued in 1859 that unlike almost every other English colony, Rhode Island wasn't based on possession by right of discovery. As Roger Williams had argued 25 years before, there were already people living there. Surely they had ownership of the land, even if they weren't Christians. He wasn't alone in this position. Other European thinkers had the same idea, but of course it was never as popular an idea as possession by discovery. I had a few listeners write in after episode 412, asking why the colonists seemed to act, for lack of a better word, entitled to American land. And I think this is part of the reason. Not every colonist, but nearly every colony, and enough of those colonies' leaders and officers, came to their dealings with Native Americans with this mindset. Indian land was theirs, by the grace of God and English law, and they meant this literally. Its current inhabitants were more like squatters than true owners, as was clear by how they failed to improve the land along correct European lines. One could use almost any method, purchase, bribery, coercion, or force, to eject a squatter. All's fair in love and law. Also, take into account the culture the colonists came from. In England, land meant wealth and status, and it was hard to get, wrapped up in deeds and charters and inheritances going back centuries. America had just as long a history of land ownership, but not in a way the colonists recognised. The potential wealth on offer was vast. All of which neatly brings us to the Atherton Company. The Atherton Company ties together everything we've touched on already. Rhode Island's difficult relationship with the other colonies, the rivalry between Narragansett and Mohegan, colonial determination to get a hold of native land by hook or crook. In June 1659, a group of settlers came together to form the Narragansett Proprietors, although it's much better known as the Atherton Company, named after one of its leading members, Major Henry Atherton. Atherton was joined by leading colonists from all the United Colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth especially, including John Winthrop Jr., the governor of Connecticut. These proprietors arranged for Cojonaquant, the cousin of a dead Sachem, to grant them 6,000 acres of land out of friendship and affection, which is lovely. Except it wasn't his land to give away. His cousin's widow was still alive, and it was hers. But it was enough of a claim to form the company. They just needed a way to get that land. So, Roger Williams of Rhode Island was invited into the company by the other proprietors in order to use his close ties and good diplomatic links with the Narragansett to acquire the land. Williams refused, calling the Atherton Company's plans a, quote, unneighbourly and unchristian intrusion, contrary to your laws as well as ours, end quote. This was before Rhode Island received its charter, but the colony already had laws on the books forbidding the seizure or purchase of native land without indigenous consent and the approval of colonial authorities. But William's refusal did not stop the Atherton Company. The next year, an armed force was sent out by the United Colonies into Narragansett territory. They had come to demand that the Narragansett pay for damage that their feud with the Mohegans had caused English settlements. The fine was 595 fathoms of wampum, shell beads which were an accepted currency in northeastern America. This was an extortionate amount, and the English demanded that they pay up within 4 months, or else. Now the Atherton Company stepped forward. They offered to cover the Narragansett fine on their behalf in return for a mortgage on a vast chunk of land, the same land they had earlier claimed through Cojonaquant's gift. This would give the Narragansett an extra 2 months to gather the wampum and pay the Atherton Company back. Once they squared up, their written agreement would be null and void. If they couldn't, well, that's what the mortgage was for. You can see where this is going. When the debt came due, the Atherton Company demanded that land in lieu. Daniel Mandel says that the Narragansett were unable to pay, presumably because it was such a massive amount of wampum and they needed longer to collect it all. Whereas Lisa Brooks says the debt was ready to be paid, but the company refused to accept payment because they'd already begun dividing up the land. As if this wasn't confusing enough, another rival claimed the same land, a group of Rhode Islanders, this time led by Samuel Wildboar. They presented a new deed, which stated that the Narragansett had granted the land to them. The same Narragansett and the same land. Rival colonists began tearing up fence posts and knocking down buildings in the night to undo the improvements which justified ownership. By the end of 1662, the Atherton Company, the Wildboar Group, and the Narragansett had all sent complaints to London, seeking the king's protection from the others. This was both a legal land dispute and a struggle for power between the United Colonies, the Narragansett, and Rhode Island. In March 1665, the Royal Commissioners, sent to settle the colonies after the seizure of New Amsterdam, arrived in Rhode Island, and they summoned a conference on the contested land. At the conference, the Narragansett were represented by their Sachem, Quissaquanch, and he made a persuasive case against the Atherton Company. He stated that the deed they were brandishing, the basis of their claim to the land, was a fraud. Cojonaquant had no authority to sell the land, and the Atherton Company knew that. The Sachem said that Cojonaquant was, quote-unquote, simple, the Atherton Company knew that, and that they'd got him drunk. After a several-day-long bender, Cojonaquant ended up in Boston, where he gifted them the land. Quissaquanch went on, saying that the Narragansett leaders had realized this was a trap and tried to pay the mortgage, but the Atherton Company said they couldn't accept the payment because Governor Winthrop was away. The commissioners heard testimony from the other parties, but they were convinced by the Narragansett. The commissioners decided that the Atherton Company had acted fraudulently, and both their deed and the mortgage were declared void. They were ordered to remove any of their settlers from the disputed land. This was a huge blow to the Atherton Company's plans, but though the commissioners had ruled against them, they were not simply going to give up. London was, after all, very far away. But it wasn't all a win for the Narragansett. The commissioners declared them fully under the jurisdiction of the English king, and ordered their symbolic submission, to place their weapons at the feet of the commissioners and accept Charles II's protection. The king's authority would be represented by the new colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. The commissioners took the spirit of that new colonial charter and made it clear to the United Colonies that from now on they were only to settle land with the consent of the Indians. They dismantled the old argument that God had given the earth to the children of men, and they had to be civilized and improve that land. Quote, "Children of men comprehends Indians as well as English, and no doubt the country is theirs till they give it up or sell it, though it not be improved." End quote. The decisions of the Commission, not to mention the newly strengthened position of Rhode Island, put the cat among the pigeons. The United Colonies were suddenly on the back foot. Plymouth Colony was particularly rocked, because they didn't have a royal charter. Rhode Island's boundaries were now extended east of Narragansett Bay into Wampanoag territory previously claimed by Plymouth. This questioned the validity of many agreements and colonial settlements. Not only were these lands now technically part of Rhode Island, but the commissioners had made clear that the only legitimate settlements were ones the Native Americans consented to. So, Plymouth's leaders set about shoring up those claims, and summoned the Sachem of the Wampanoag, Philip, to Plymouth to do just that. Philip had been Sachem for a few years now, and despite his brother's suspicious death in English custody, or perhaps because of it, he remained cooperative with Plymouth. So when the colonists invited him to confirm territorial agreements, he came along. That's why we have Philip's mark, acknowledging the town of Taunton on land his father had sold. This had been a verbal agreement, or perhaps it was written down but the deed had been lost. Now Plymouth had written evidence to support Taunton's existence. Philip came back again in 1665, confirming the bounds of the town of Dartmouth. Now Plymouth had met the requirements of the Royal Commissioners. Or had they? Because both the Taunton and Dartmouth deeds were written in English, which Philip could not read. Luckily, Plymouth could call on the services of someone who could both read the deed and translate it into Wampanoag, one John Sachem. Sachem acted as a translator and interpreter for all the deeds which Philip signed in this period. He also went along on the surveys of Dartmouth, representing the Wampanoag. However, historians, particularly Jill Lepore and Lisa Brooks, are highly suspicious of Sachem's true intentions, because he was involved in a hell of a lot of shady-looking deals. With how contradictory some of these documents are, and with how much fighting would take place in these areas during the war, it's easy to believe that Philip did not realize the extent or permanence of these sales. And if he didn't understand, it was Sachem's job to make it clear. Philip wasn't naive. He knew that the English viewed land ownership differently to the Wampanoag. If, and it is an if, he signed these documents believing they said something else, that would explain later disputes. And if that's the case, then why did Sachem not say something? There are other reasons to be sceptical of Sachemon's sincerity in his dealings with Philip and other Wampanoag leaders. The Dartmouth Deed, which Sachem helped survey and which he translated for Philip, expanded the original bounds of the settlement into land held by Weetamoo's community of Pocasset. As we covered before, it wasn't in Philip's power to sell or give away that land. He'd agreed to that 15 years ago. His brother and Weetamoo's husband might have died, but Philip himself was still married to Weetamoo's sister, so that family bond was still tight. Sachem was also listed as a witness to other deeds, which claimed to have Weetamoo's consent for the sale. He also witnessed the Atherton Company's confirmation, before it was thrown out by the Royal Commissioners as a fraud, as well as the Talman Deed. Sachem would eventually marry into Philip's family, only to then draft a will for Philip, in which the Sachem bequeathed a large part of Wampanoag territory to one beneficiary, John Sachem. Like every other document, it was in English, and though Philip would have known some English words, the technical language of legal documents would probably be beyond him. Sachem was trusted to interpret them in good faith, and it appears, from the documents we have, that he used that trust to enrich himself. Even in land sales where he was not a direct beneficiary, Sachem was paid by the United Colonies, officially for his help as a translator. As Brooks puts it, the track record of deceptive documents in which Sachem was embroiled makes nearly any deed in which he appears as witness or interpreter highly questionable. Earlier, we mentioned that Alexander granted Peter Talman of Rhode Island a vast tract of land, and that this grant included his wife Weetamoo's land at Pocasset. It will not surprise you to learn that Weetamoo was not going to simply accept her husband giving away her land. Weetamoo knew all about the rivalry between Rhode Island and the United Colonies. She understood well the competing claims of authority, and as we saw with the 1650 deed, she was fully aware of the power of the written word. So when the Talman Deed came to light in 1662, Weetamoo joined with other Sonsquas who were threatened by the deed to protest it. And, in light of their knowledge of colonial politics, they complained about the Rhode Island grant to Plymouth. The Wampanoag Sonsquas were playing the colonies against each other. It was, after all, in Plymouth's interest to invalidate the Talman Deed, and the court records show how angry the colony was with Alexander. He was meant to only sell to them. This strategy did carry a risk, apart from Weetamoo's husband dying in custody. Plymouth was a beneficiary of the Atherton Company's claim to Weetamoo's land. By appealing to Plymouth, that claim got stronger. But Weetamoo didn't just appeal to Plymouth's self-interest. In case Talman appealed to Rhode Island, she needed something to balance the scales, and she found it in the figures of John Sanford Jr. and John Archer. Both men were residents of Portsmouth in Rhode Island, and friendly neighbours of Weetamoo. The three of them drafted a deed where Weetamoo gifted the contested land to the two men. Now, if Talman tried to have Rhode Island assert his rights, then Weetamoo could counter it. That land was already granted to her neighbours. But Weetamoo hadn't just made the written agreement. She'd also made an oral one. Sanford and Archer would have the deed, but the understanding was that it was really a fake and had no power. They would give it back to her when she asked, and have no real ownership of the land. She gave them corn and wampum as both payment and a symbolic pledge. The two Johns went along with this deal, but at some point they got greedy. Yes, they had only been given the deed to ward off Talman, but they still had the deed. The land was theirs, to do with as they wished. What could Weetamoo do about it? And here's where I think Weetamoo's keen grasp of the complicated networks of power, authority, and culture are most clear. Weetamoo had cultivated friends and allies across the colonial settlements. Two of those friends were Richard and Mary Sisson, who were acquainted with Archer and Sanford. 5 years later, in 1667, the Sissons submitted written testimony to Plymouth Court that when Archer had been at their house, he'd confided that the deed they held was part of a defence against Talman and Alexander, that Weetamoo had given them corn and wampum, and that they had promised to return the deed to her when she asked. Mary Sisson added that Archer had been riven with guilt over the betrayal. Once again, using Plymouth's desire to act as the main adjudicator for the Indians, Weetamoo brought evidence which voided a written deed. Weetamoo was clearly a shrewd politician. Talman used Alexander and Sachem to get a written deed. Weetamoo pit Plymouth against Rhode Island to resist it, then used Archer and Sanford to muddy the legal waters, and then used Plymouth and the Sissons to counter their betrayal. It was a dance that lasted years, but there was less and less room to manoeuvre as the years went on. The demand for land was only growing. Meanwhile, Philip was leading his people in a world fundamentally changed from when his father had first governed. One of those changes was the collapse of the deer population from overhunting and the changing landscape. To replace deer in the Wampanoag diet, Philip turned to pigs. The same pigs which rampaged through New England despite the complaints of the Wampanoag. But the Indians didn't just hunt the pigs. They adopted some colonial methods, including keeping their pigs separated from their crops by water. Philip oversaw the transport of a viable pig population to Chesawannock, an island just east of his village of Montauk, now appropriately called Hog Island. Surrounded by water, the pigs could roam free, flourishing happily, until hunting parties arrived at least, and Wampanoag crops would be spared. But in an ironic reversal, now it was the colonists' turn to complain about roving pigs, because though the Wampanoag weren't farming on Chesawannock, the English were, including people we just met, John Archer and William Sisson from nearby Portsmouth. Even worse, the Wampanoag were taking part in the growing meat trade. Surplus pork was smoked or salted and taken to Boston for market, shipped off to the West Indies for a tidy profit. The Wampanoag were adapting to this new world, and not to everyone's liking. Thank you for listening to this episode of Pax Britannica. This podcast simply wouldn't be possible without the support of my Patreon House of Lords, which has now been joined by Orlando, now Earl of Ripon, James, Earl Kilmartin, and Corrin, Earl Shedler. They join my existing patrons, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Jara Kotowski, the Duke of Newcastle, Jonathan Williams, the Marquis of Arbroath, Stefan Mensikov, and the Earl of Bradford, Richard Liddell. Thank you to all of my patrons, those I've mentioned and those I haven't. If you're not a patron and you're on the fence about becoming one, for just $5 a month you can listen to this episode and every other episode ad-free. Patrons also receive the monthly Britannica Gazette Q&A and a Patreon-only chat room. Go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica for more information. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music used in this episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.